What's going on, everybody? This is Roaming Prepper, and thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to talk about a very interesting subject that came up about the expansionist behavior that we're seeing in Southeast Asia, and at least from our perspective, what that may entail down the road. I'll be right back, and let's talk about it a little bit more. Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for joining me again. I'm your host, Pete, and this is a Roaming Prepper channel. So today I do want to talk about something that's come up on our radar a few times as a community that I think we aren't paying as much attention to as we really need to. And what I'm talking about is the maritime expansionism of the Chinese government and what that may mean for those of us here in the West, what it could mean for countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, Malaysia. You know, these are all large countries as well. Their economic impact is significant. So we want to talk about them. I'm not going to keep this too long, but I do want you guys to think about this a little bit. So recently there was a report, and I saw it on Fox and MSN, and I've also seen it on more of the independent and fringe news. So it's popped up in multiple places. So at that point you start saying it's a trend. They're deploying what they are calling the Maritime Militia, is what it's being called, from China. Now, they're saying it's a militia. It's not a militia the way a Westerner would think of it, like an American or Canadian or even someone from the UK or France, where militia is the citizens who are armed, right? We get invaded by whoever, the military goes out, and then they need more people, so they form civilian militias. They train you and off you go, or you protect your homes. What these folks are, the Maritime Militia is actually a large fleet of fishing vessels and surveying vessels and stuff like that, but they are armed. Now, these are vessels that normally, unless they're going through pirate-infested waters, are not armed, right? Most freighters do not have armament, and they certainly don't have mounted turrets on them or a contingent of military personnel or trained personnel on board. Now, there are some exceptions, you know, like in Somalia and Ethiopia, some of those areas, South America, you do get attacks by pirates on shipping channels, or shipping lanes, I should say. So there are some vessels that are armed. They usually hire private contractors to protect the boat from whatever intruder. But this is literally a fleet of fishing vessels. Large fishing vessels, like the one you'd see on TV. These are not insignificant sized ships, and they are armed. They're collectively armed. Now, they don't specify what kind of armaments they have, but they are armed. But because they're not a military vessel, it's a maritime ship. And you see where they're kind of going into this weird gray area of, well, they're armed, but not really. But yeah, they are. And what they're doing, they're actually going into the fisheries of Japan, the Philippines, Malaysia, South Korea, even Vietnam, ironically. And they're cultivating and consuming and harvesting the seafood and product of those nations' national waters, like their normal fisheries. And these are, by the way, you know, in one case, it was like 200 miles from the Philippines or 100 miles from the Philippines. It was over 1,000 from China. But China claimed that they have sovereignty over the entire area. And this is where I'm going with this. This is concerning to me because it seems like they're setting a precedent for conflict. You start introducing armed vessels, whether they are formally flagged as military or not, that's still, for all intents and purposes, an armed military incursion. Whether they're in uniforms, whether they specifically are there for military purposes, you've put an armed vessel into another nation's space. That inevitably can cause conflict. That is how problems occur. So the Philippine Coast Guard has actually challenged these boats, and now, because they got run off in the past, they've come back, still armed, but now they have a Chinese military vessel like a frigate or a destroyer of some type in the distance, simply patrolling, not 50 kilometers away. So that's not a very big distance. A ship of that size can close that distance very quick. They can certainly attack you from that distance away using missiles and rockets, if nothing else. And they can close that distance very quickly. So what exactly is the end game? Like, where does this benefit the PRC? Well, what they're trying to do is establish a precedent, much like they have by building these islands out of what used to be reefs. There were no islands there. They've built islands that are now airfields, that are now, radar installations, ship docks. And what they're trying to do is basically create a barrier, a standoff from their mainland against the Japanese, US, Filipino, and other navies to keep them away from that. So think about it. If something were to pop off in Taiwan, yeah, we'd have Taiwan, China, and everyone would be fighting there. But all of these little islands that are adjacent to the busiest shipping lane in the world are all going to have and be capable of firing rockets, cannons, and launching aircraft at whatever vessel happens to be in the way. Now, through the South China Sea, roughly a third, if not more, of our entire global trade goes through that area. Because keep in mind, India ships through there, the US ships through there, Australia, China, of course, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, all of these countries ship through those areas. So if you suddenly introduce a barrier, or more importantly, if you start disrupting that shipping, it's going to have a catastrophic effect on everything. So, that's all fine and dandy and doomy and gloomy, but what does that mean for us? What does that mean for preppers? Now, you guys know my style. I try and leave you with a video that says, hey, what do you do? Well, keep in mind, what products do we get from there? We get electronics, which are slowly coming back to the US. I think that's overdue. That's a whole nother video. There's a lot of clothing products that come from that part of the world. There's a lot of food products, such as rice. Large amounts of rice, like basmati rice, jasmine rice, come from India, come from those parts of the world. Of course, Vietnam does a lot of manufacturing of clothing and clothing type goods, Malaysia as well. Also, there are significant oil and gas reserves in the South China Sea, closer to Malaysia, offshore Philippines, that China is slowly trying to encroach on. And what they're trying to do is scare everyone else away so they can consolidate and ultimately start drilling for oil and gas. Because regardless of how woke we are in the West, China gives zero ass as to whether or not we use electric cars, because they're going to use the gas and oil they need to get what they want. Bottom line. Okay, so while we're worried about some political issue over here, they're looking at life and death. We have fuel, we can beat everyone up. And if you're not seeing that, that's concerning. But going back to what we should look for, again, oil and gas, again, that's going to affect fuel prices. That's, as we already saw, that's going to affect diesel. When diesel gets affected, then food gets affected, transport gets affected, canned goods get affected. Also keep in mind the clothing, the food products, right? So this is a good guideline for all of us to say, you know what? What are the things that may affect me personally? And you may have to look at some labels. You may have to do a little reading. Start looking at how is this going to affect me, and in what products might be affected if something ugly goes on. If there's a blockade, let's say the US and Philippines say, you know what, you suck, we're going to blockade you just to be shits. And they start arguing about that. They don't have to fire any shots. They're going to completely screw up trade for, 2 months. And we've already seen when you have a supply chain disruption, about 4 to 6 months later, it hits the prices in the grocery stores, if not sooner. So now's a good time. Take an assessment of what you get regularly, whether it's medication, whether it's rice, whether it's clothing, and try to make sure you have enough of what you need to get you through a short-term hardship if they decide to blockade each other. Okay, just leaving you with that thought. This is, I know, started a little doomy and gloomy, but I'm just trying to give you guys perspective. When you see something like this in the news, you got to ask yourself, how is it going to affect me? It may be a broad stroke in which it affects you. It could be a lot of things that affect you. Or something like this might be more specific items that you consume or you use that may come from that part of the world that you need to take into account when you're prepping. So anyway, guys, continue to do what you need to do. God bless, Godspeed, and again, pay attention to how these things interact, because that will tell us a lot about what we need to be doing. Take care. I'll see you on the next one.